Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Chris Bird. I'm here on behalf of the COVID-19 Coastal Bend Task Force. It's March 5th, 2021, and this is our weekly update. The task force, just to remind you, has two objectives. We're here to address public concerns and questions about COVID-19, as well as to enable evidence-based decision-making on behalf of our local leaders. There are several interventions taking place to combat the transmission of COVID-19. One is to get vaccinated. Everybody's encouraged to get vaccinated if they're eligible. Try to avoid crowds, wear face coverings, and social distance. Even though on March 10th the state mandate to wear face coverings and social distance will end, the governor still strongly encourages everybody to continue wearing their face coverings. This is more of a legal change than a recommendation on what people should do. Next, you're encouraged to isolate when you're exposed or asymptomatic, which would be any sort of signs of cold or flu-like symptoms. There's partial to all remote schooling, depending upon which school you attend. And Open Texas will be going to 100% on March 10th, so we will no longer be limiting the occupancy in businesses, and presumably this would include bars also. I want to remind everybody that on nuacesnose.com they have a risk dashboard, and right now it indicates that there's still extreme risk. There's a number of different factors that they use to determine this, and if any of them are in the extreme category, then the overall recommendation is, or the overall alert is extreme risk. And one of the categories right now is in extreme risk. So far, we've had 40,918 total confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the Coastal Bend. A confirmed case is a case that's identified using a PCR test or some other test combined with a doctor's diagnosis. Of these 40,918, there have been 38,823 recoveries. This week, the number of active cases is down 23% to 939. Now, that being said, even though the number of active cases is down, there has been a rise in the number of new cases per day. So here is our graph where we show the transmission rate. The transmission rate is simply, on average, how many additional people are infected per infected person. So if the value is 1, then COVID stays at the same level. If the number is greater than 1, then COVID expands. We're right here at the dashed line. So based upon the model calibration to the new cases per week, which you can see here with the black dots being the new cases per week and the orange dots being the model projection, we calibrate the model like this. You can see there's a fairly good fit with that smoother line through the black points, and that translates into this transmission rate, or we're controlling the transmission rate to get this fit. So based upon that, we're right here, and the transmission rate is 1.08. It's slightly above 1, which is describing this increase that you see over here on the calibration curve. Right, and so what's triggering that is that there's been an uptick over the past week in the number of new cases in Nueces, as well as some of the other counties. When we zoom in the Coastal Bend, you can see Jim Wells, San Patricio, Aransas, Clayburgh, Refugio, Duval, and B counties have all seen an uptick over the last week or even the last day or two in the amount of new COVID cases being reported. When we look at the hospitals, and we're particularly focused on the ICUs, the downward trend continues in the ICUs. We're down to 30 patients in the hospital on March 30th, or in the ICU on March 30th that have COVID, and 156 that don't have COVID. This is across all ICU patients in the Coastal Bend. So the number of COVID ICU patients continues to decrease. If you look across Texas, you'll see a similar pattern in most of the different trauma service areas. I encourage you to pause the video and inspect the different tabs here, or the different panels here, if you're interested in a particular region in Texas. this is a graph that shows only one day. It's just like those last graphs, except it only shows one day, and it makes the maximum number of patients be 100% here. So red equals COVID patients, blue equals non-COVID patients in the ICU. And what this gives you is a nice visual of how stressed or strained ICUs are by COVID. The more red you see, the more strained and stressed they are. The less red you see, the less strained. And I was remarking in our task force meeting today that I don't think we've seen I don't think we've seen so much blue in this figure since we started presenting it. So it looks like most of the state is moving in the right direction when it comes to pressure on the ICU. Moving on to fatalities, we've had now 1,156 fatalities from those people that tested positive for COVID-19. Now, these are counted from death certificates by the state, and the primary cause of death is determined to be COVID-19. And here's the number that we have for Nueces. We get this number from the state, so it's a day or two old, and the number might be slightly higher if you look at cctexas.com. These numbers get processed over the course of 2 weeks, so this flat line that you see here is somewhat misleading because it represents also death certificates that haven't been counted yet. Moving on to vaccinations. What I'm going to do here this week is something a little bit different. We're showing you the percentage of people vaccinated in each of the coastal Bend counties last week versus this week. And we go back and forth there a little bit. So you can see that we've had an increase, obviously in the number of people that have been fully vaccinated. So these are now people that have had both shots of either the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. And in Nueces County, we're right near 10%. And if you look at Kennedy, that's the highest percentage of vaccinations at over 20%. Zooming out to the whole state, broken down by trauma service area, and here we are right here in the coastal Bend. This is the number of, or the percentage of the population with at least one vaccine dose. And so this is 1 or 2 doses, and you can see in the coastal Bend we're approaching about 14%. We're between 13 and 14% of the population has had at least 1 dose. And if you look at us compared to, I'm sorry, that's last week, and here's this week. So last week we're at 13%. This week we're at 16%. And what you can see is that we're getting pretty close to the top of all trauma service areas in the state in terms of proportion of the population vaccinated. And it seems that this may be a function of counties and trauma service areas that are really efficient at getting out the vaccine. They might receive a few more vaccines than some other counties where there's more demand for vaccine. That may be where it gets directed. Hopefully, for us in the coastal Bend, we remain very efficient at vaccinating our population, and everybody who's been vaccinated thus far should be commended. And I got vaccinated myself today, first dose. I have no pain, I have no side effects. I waited in line for 2 hours. It was slightly longer than I thought it was going to be, but it wasn't that bad compared to the waits that people were having at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sorry, at the beginning of the vaccine rollout. So with that being said, the big news this week is that the mask mandate and social distancing mandate are being repealed. And so we thought it was prescient this week to talk about what would happen if not only if not only were those mandates rolled back, which is going to happen, but if everybody decided to stop wearing masks, if everybody decided to go back to normal, and we just rely on vaccinations to control the transmission rate of COVID, what would it look like? And so that's one of the things that we can use our model to do. And we made some primary assumptions. No model is a perfect representation of real life, and this is not meant to be a crystal ball. It's more of a what if, what's possible. And we made some overly optimistic assumptions. We assumed that the recovered are immune. That's inherent in the model that we use, so we made that assumption. We assume that the vaccinated are immune. Now we know neither of these are actually true, but it makes it so that we're going to have a lowball estimate of how big a peak could be if we try to go back to normal right now. The transmission rate, we're assuming, is not affected by new variants. We know that there's new variants. We know that the transmission rate is increasing in new variants, but we're just going to make the assumption in the model that that's not happening. And lastly, we're going to assume that there's approximately 30,000 new vaccinations per week throughout this projection. Right now, that's overly optimistic. Maybe in the distant part of the model, maybe it'll be undershooting. But this was what we saw as a good starting point for this week to put into the model. Now, the other assumptions concerning mitigations are that there are no other mitigations implemented in the model. No masks, no social distancing, no remote work or school, just going 100% back to normal, with the exception of 30,000 people per week in the coastal bend get vaccinated. So here's the results of that. So in blue, we have our actual model fit up to the present day, which is this dashed line, and then the projection, which is in blue, which we showed earlier with a transmission rate of 1.08 today. And then in orange, we have the scenario where if we only relied on vaccinations starting on March 10th and we everything else went back to normal. No more masks, no more social distancing, no more anything. What would happen? We can see the transmission rate will rise to go above, or would rise to go above 2 in that scenario, and then it would fairly rapidly decline and eventually go below 1. Now let's take a look at how that translates into new cases per day. What you see here in the plot, these dots are the actual number of new cases per day. This is the summer peak in 2020 in June and July. And then this is our fall-winter outbreak, which peaked somewhere right around January, early to mid-January. Here's where we are now. In orange and blue here, we have our model projection or model fit to the data, and then projection out into the future. The orange line is the scenario where if we try to go back to normal with the only mitigation being vaccinations. And you can see that the model is projecting that there would be a very large peak and number of new cases per day if we only relied on vaccinations in this scenario. And it's also projecting that there would be a very large peak in additional hospitalizations. This would be over 1,000 people in the hospital on at the peak that have COVID-19. So a large peak is still possible here, and if you heard me earlier this week or you hear me talking today, this is why we're recommending that you continue to social distance. You should continue to wear your masks. It's too early right now to take off our masks. It is possible to have another large peak. We need more of the population to be vaccinated before it's okay to try to go back to normal right now. So hopefully this was useful in showing you how we're making our decisions and our recommendations from the task force. Fatalities, again, if we assume the same fatality rate that we've seen through early 2021, there's a projection that there could be a large increase in fatalities also. So in summary, the transmission rate is 1.08. At least that's our best estimate of it right now. New cases are increasing. Hospitalizations and fatalities are still declining, but if new cases continue to increase, then hospitalizations and fatalities will generally follow. Based on the scenario that we ran, if we rely only on vaccinations to slow down COVID transmission, there will be another major outbreak. So it's all the more reason for us to stay vigilant. Get vaccinated if you can. Wear your face coverings. If you can get a KN95, I highly recommend it. Again, these KN95 masks, they really fit tightly to your face, and I found that they stop my glasses from fogging up as much. So there's really a nice benefit from them. If you don't have a KN95 and you have one of those surgical masks, it's good to put a cotton mask over top of that, because that improves the fit around your face and it increases the efficacy to the equivalent of a 92 on that KN or N95 scale. So that's the double up recommendation. Social distance, and again, it's not time to go back to normal. It's not time to throw big celebrations. You're encouraged to stay vigilant, and the longer or the more adherent we are to these principles, the faster the pandemic's going to be over. I'd like to thank you for tuning in this week. Remember that you can post questions and comments on our social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is @CBCovid. You can look us up. We're also on YouTube. If you want to look at the videos there, this report is stored on Facebook, and you can see it anytime. We address all the questions that we get each week on Fridays at noon in a question and answer session with both myself and the Public Health Director, Annette Rodriguez, as well as task force members Tiffany Anderson and Jason Lewis. And we're happy to address any questions that you have. All right, I hope everybody has a great and safe weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.